afternoon. Happy almost spring. And for those that are local, I hope you enjoyed the little hailstorm we had a while back. Welcome to our first collaboration event between the Wonders of the World, or WOW, and the Sweet Thursday webinar series. Both WOW and Sweet Thursday are programs sponsored by the Friends of the Lafayette Library and Learning Center, which is the all-volunteer organization that sells used books to support the Lafayette Library. I'm Ellen Reinces, the volunteer coordinator for the WOW program, and I'm joined today by Jeff Deeden, who will come on in a little bit, who is the coordinator for Sweet Thursday. Together, we are hosting Bay Area author Marilyn Chase, who published a book in 2020 entitled Everything She Touched, The Life of Ruth Asawa. I recently finished reading the book, and when I put it down, I felt that I really knew Ruth. Before Jeff introduces Marilyn, I'd like to bring you up to date on the Lafayette Library, which is one of 26 branches in the Contra Costa Library system. The Lafayette Library continues to be open for curbside pickup only for books that have been placed on hold. However, the county is working diligently on the logistics for reopening the branches when that time comes, and it is expected that this will not be in the too distant future once they get the official go-ahead. The Friends of the Library have traditionally hosted the WOW lectures and the Sweet Thursday author events in person. However, with no public in-person programs being held in the library complex, the Friends are holding these events online. We're in the process of scheduling new webinars, and here are a few coming attractions. On Wednesday, April 14th at 2 p.m., our popular independent lecturer, Avril Angevine, will talk about the photographer Dorothea Lange in a new lecture entitled That Such Things Could Be. And then on Wednesday, May 12th, a speaker from the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco will talk about the Calder Picasso exhibit, which just opened at the De Young, which just reopened, and it will be there through the third week in May. We have a couple of Sweet Thursdays scheduled for April. On Thursday, April 8th at 5 p.m., Sweet Thursday will host author Bonnie Suey, who will discuss her book, Why We Swim, which takes a look at why we are drawn to water even though we are not natural swimmers. And then on April 29th at 5 p.m., Sweet Thursday will host Dr. Robert Pearl, the retired head of TPMG, which is the Kaiser Permanente Physicians Group, who will discuss his recent book, Uncaring, which looks at physician culture and its effects on patient care. He spoke about another book he wrote a few years ago, and we had a sellout crowd in our community hall in the library. I'd also like to let you know about a webinar that my husband and I are doing for Contra Costa Libraries. It's a baking webinar titled Make Your Own Chocolate Truffles, and it will be held on Monday, March 29th at 6 p.m. We've been making truffles as a hobby for over 35 years, and we've offered small in-person classes at the Lafayette Library for several years prior to the pandemic, and the librarians asked us to turn this into an online event. Unfortunately, we won't be hand-dipping chocolate truffles in person with you the way we normally do when it's at the library. And if you missed the webinar or loved it so much you want to watch it again, you can visit our YouTube channel where you can find all the webinars that we have been permitted to record at tinyurl.com/friendsllc-YouTube. And we are recording today's program. If you have questions today, we ask you to type them via the Q&A function. Chat is disabled. And then at the end of the lecture, we'll choose a selection of questions to answer. And as a reminder, the Friends webinars can accommodate up to 500 people. Registration is unique. There is always the possibility of oversubscription, and Zoom lets in the first 500 people, so don't wait until the last minute to register and join the webinar. And now, so I know that many of you have heard this before, but there are probably people who are new to the library on this lecture, and we just want to let you know how best to find out about our events and sign up for them. The first is through the weekly email mailing that goes out on Saturday mornings from the Library Foundation, and they have a sign up that can be accessed through llcf.org/subscribe. Alternatively, you can go to the Contra Costa County Library site, ccclib.org, and go to the events tab at the top. That will take you to upcoming events, which lists all the scheduled events at the 26 branches, so that may be overwhelming, but there are filters on the side that will help whittle it down. For example, by location or age group or type of lecture. A little bit about the Friends. For many years, we have sold used books to raise funds to support our library. We have a retail bookshop called Friends Corner Bookshop, located on the lower level of the library complex at the back on Golden Gate Way. We also have an Amazon store where you can buy online. And in normal times, we use these funds to support extended hours, purchase books and related materials, support programs, and support our partners in the facility. It's still not a normal year. Friends Corner Bookshop is open for curbside pickup only. The Amazon store is open and can be accessed via the Friends website. However, we are still not able to accept general donations from the public. And if you want to learn more about the Friends, how to do the curbside pickup, and the all-important Shop Amazon button, you can visit our website at llcf.org/friends-book-shop. So today's speaker is Marilyn Chase, and Jeff is going to introduce her, and then he'll take it away from here. So go ahead, Jeff.
Thanks, Ellen. This has been a fun collaboration. We'll see how it goes. Our author and presenter today is Marilyn Chase. Marilyn was born and raised in Los Angeles before earning a degree in English literature from Stanford and a master's degree in journalism from Cal. Although quite distinguished, this combination creates a true big game conundrum. After more than two decades as a reporter and columnist for the Wall Street Journal, focusing on health science, she returned to independent writing and teaching. She has taught narrative writing at her alma mater, Stanford, as well as writing as a continuing lecturer for her grad school, UC Berkeley. Her previous book, The Barbary Plague, The Black Death in Victorian San Francisco, told the struggle of a young public health doctor in 1900 to quell an outbreak of bubonic plague and treat patients in the city's Chinatown against a backdrop of racism, scapegoating, and cover-up by politicians and big business. Marilyn's current book, Everything She Touched, The Life of Ruth Asawa, tells the story of a determined young artist who rebounds after being imprisoned in World War II for her Japanese American roots. Rejecting victimhood, she makes sculpture of unsurpassed originality and enhanced the lives of thousands of children by infusing art into the public schools. Everything She Touched was named a favorite book of 2020 by Smithsonian scholars, and Art News named it among 7 essential books on artist biography. Everything She Touched, The Life of Ruth Asawa, can be purchased at Orinda Books. Marilyn, welcome to the Lafayette Library and Learning Center.
Thank you so much. I want to give special thanks to the Lafayette Library and its cultural programs, to Jeffrey Deedon and Ellen Righteous and everyone involved in WOW and Sweet Thursday, and special thanks for being nice enough to make Sweet Thursday on a Wednesday. Since in my other life, I'm teaching at UC Berkeley and my class happens to be on Thursday. I'm especially thrilled to be with you because this book had its inception in a library, if you can believe it. I would like to say that I got a flash of inspiration while attending an art auction or visiting a gallery, but in fact, being a reporter who is incurably fascinated by archives and libraries, that's where the spark first occurred. So now if I can call on the technology gods to help me, I will share some of the graphics that I had an opportunity to use in my research in my book. Are you seeing this, folks? If I could ask Jeffrey and Ellen to let me know.
I can see the first slide that.
Right, it's
There-
coming.
Hit play. Hit play.
Yeah, just a second here. I've got,
At the top.
I just needed to minimize your gallery view there.
Okay.
There we go. Okay, so I came to this project in the summer of 2014, not as any particular expert in art history or in Japanese American culture, but simply as a reporter and an author, because that's when I learned that the artist Ruth Asawa's family had given her papers to Stanford University. The collection comprised an amazing 275 boxes of letters, photos, drawings, sketches, date books, calendars, everything from elementary school play programs to college and art school course notes, plans for sculptures and fountains, and all the big dreams to share her ideas with the public school children of the Bay Area. Some realized and some that were left unfulfilled. I was mainly drawn to the human story of Ruth Asawa, a hero's journey, really, that took her from a Depression-era childhood on a poor truck farm to World War II prison camp in Arkansas, and on through struggles in a racist post-war society, and on to a life dedicated to creating art and giving public service to her community. So let me introduce you to the young Ruth Asawa as I first met her in my research. Shown here at 13, she was the middle child of 7, born in 1926 on a truck farm near Los Angeles. A child of the Great Depression, she, like all her siblings, had to pull her weight on the farm, helping plant and harvest crops before school, after school, on weekends and holidays. The family was so poor that to build the family's board and batten farmhouse, her father recycled old nails, straightening them out for reuse. In school, that was Ruth's playtime because she loved to draw, paint, and cartoon. More often at home, she was found planting onions and looping string beans on a trellis. But even in the fields, she expressed her creative drive by tracing figure-8 designs with her toes in the dirt while riding on the back of her father's farm wagon. You'll see how these figure-8s come into play when she later becomes a sculptor. All these skills, looping string beans, tracing figure-8s, and making wire figures out of the little wires that would crate vegetables, would find their way into her art. But in December 1941, when Pearl Harbor drew the US into war, life changed for the Asawas and 120,000 others in the West Coast Japanese American community. When President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, roundups began. In February, 2 FBI agents descended on the Asawa's farm and arrested her father as he tended his strawberry crop. They gave him just enough time to eat lunch while his daughter pressed his best black suit, and then off they went, whisking him to an undisclosed location, an interrogation site, and later on to an enemy alien camp in Lordsburg, New Mexico. In April 1942, Ruth, her mother, brothers and sisters were all ordered to report to an assembly center at Santa Anita Racetrack, where they were numbered, tagged, assigned to a mess hall, and given sleeping quarters in a horse stall that was hastily coated with whitewash and patched with linoleum over the earthen floor that failed completely to mask the scent of the animal occupants. One bright spot was that Ruth got a chance to meet Japanese American artists from Disney Studios, who were also interned there, Tom Okamoto, Chris Ishii, and James Tanaka. These men had worked on famous animated feature films like Pinocchio and Snow White, and they were inspiring role models for Ruth, teaching drawing and perspective, sharing charcoal and real art paper with the students at the racetrack. But after 6 months of this interim assembly period, the Asawas and thousands of others were transferred to a permanent camp at Rohr Relocation Center in Arkansas. There they lived in a tar paper barracks with communal toilets, rudimentary classrooms, a grim outpost enclosed by barbed wire and studded with gun towers like this, with spotlights for the duration of the war. They were told that the gun towers were for their own safety. But why, the young Ruth wondered, were the soldiers' guns always pointed inward toward the inmates, people whose only crime was looking like the enemy? Well, here you can see Ruth in front of one of those tar paper barracks. She wrote that the most precious thing her mother brought with her from home were seeds, and many families planted little gardens in front of their barracks to provide a personal touch of home. Ruth, standing beside this trellis with those climbing vines, reminds us of her farm chores at home, looping those string beans, a skill that forecast the looped wire of her sculptures. Here's one of Ruth's student paintings done in camp, a watercolor of the moody bayou landscape surrounding the barracks, with those little barracks reflected in the water. She also did watercolors of sumo wrestling, which was, along with baseball, one of the sports allowed in camp. Since inmates imprisoned in camp were banned from having radios or cameras as contraband, Ruth would draw the members of her high school graduating class, in which she was voted the most artistic girl. On graduating from that camp high school in 1943, Ruth received this ID card for indefinite leave. It's an image that's now in the Smithsonian's Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C. She was released to attend college in the Midwest because she had to stay away from the West Coast, as Japanese American people were still under suspicion as potential spies or saboteurs. She chose Milwaukee State Teachers College, where she could study to become an art teacher, a practical choice, for the grand sum of $25 a semester. Can you imagine? Funded with a Quaker scholarship and her earnings as a live-in, maid, nanny, and tannery worker. But after 3 years of college work and hard labor to finance her studies, she was barred from the 4th year of student teaching due to racist attitudes in the country that were still prevalent then. She was denied her degree and credential because no public school in Wisconsin would have a Japanese American teacher, and because her college advisors believed that she would be unsafe. A happy footnote, however, although it was late in coming, the University of Wisconsin, which later acquired Milwaukee State Teachers College, did award Ruth her degree in 1998, just 50 years too late. But at the time, Ruth needed a little help from her friends back in the 1940s. So some of her college classmates in Milwaukee urged her to follow them to Black Mountain College, an experimental art school where the pioneers of modern art were gathering. With her practical career pathway as an art teacher basically barred by bias, there was nothing to stop her from actually pursuing her real dream and heart's desire, which was to become a working artist. So off she went to Black Mountain College. This is a picture of Ruth sitting on the porch of one of those buildings at Black Mountain, where she found an exciting experimental art lab where students of all backgrounds gathered. One of her first roommates was a Black painter and collagist named Mary Parks Washington, who took this photo and whom I was privileged to interview before she passed recently. The young art students learned from the greats like painter Joseph Albers, the modern dancer Merce Cunningham, and composer John Cage. Ruth enrolled in color and design with Joseph Albers, who became a lifelong mentor. She planned on a summer and ended up staying for 3 years. Well, here you can see a picture of Joseph Albers presiding over his classroom. He was a strict taskmaster, an emigre who had fled Germany when the Nazis closed the Bauhaus. Albers taught students to open their eyes and see, and to respect craft with humility. He also invoked Zen principles, such as yin and yang, that struck a chord with Ruth because of her cultural background. The story goes that he actually refused to meet with her until she cleaned up her studio. And after that, they bonded over painting, color studies, and their mutual reverence for craft. Here you can see another one of Ruth's beloved mentors at Black Mountain, Buckminster Fuller, the futurist, engineer, and creator of the geodesic dome. Ruth really relished Fuller's sculptural geometries and his philosophy of living with less on spaceship Earth. She would later bring Buckminster Fuller into San Francisco classrooms to share his ideas with students. Here's an early abstract, a watercolor from Asawa's Black Mountain days, where you can see both the influence of Joseph Albers' vibrant color studies and abstract forms suggesting dancers' bodies. If you look at the little figure on the lower left, you might imagine a modern dancer with her arms raised in motion. Another one of Ruth's Black Mountain watercolors is this study of leaves. The students were so poor in terms of what they had available to them that they often went gathering leaves, rocks, plant materials to study for their classes. And they made collages from leaves. And in this case, she painted leaves. And you can see the sort of color vibration between adjacent colors that Albers would speak of in his color classes. She also loved to use transparent watercolor washes at play here. I love this poetic portrait of Ruth in the snow at Black Mountain. One of the joys of being in art school was the students' closeness to nature near the Blue Ridge Mountains. Students often went on hikes with their professors and with one another. The trails wound around through gorgeous forests and banks of rhododendrons and other flowers. They also wound through a romantic spot known to the students as the Garden of Eden, above a place called Lake Eden. Well, on one of these walks, Ruth ran smack into a new architecture student from Georgia by the name of Albert Lanier. He was immediately swept off his feet by her beauty and also her artistic vision and her work ethic. For her part, she also liked the fact that in addition to being handsome, he could help her with her math homework. And she would advise him on his architectural projects. Before long, they were known as a couple around campus. Well, one thing led to another. And before Ruth left Black Mountain, she and Albert started planning a future together, in spite of family resistance by their rather traditional parents and legal bans then prevalent against mixed marriages in many states at the time. So they went to their teachers and asked for their blessings from Joseph Albers and Buckminster Fuller. Ruth went to Albers and asked whether he thought she could both be an artist and have a family of 6 children. Remember, this was 1948. Albers reportedly replied, yeah, you have babies, that is your art. But he told her fiance, never let her stop doing her art. Buckminster Fuller, for his part, gave Albert his wholehearted blessing to the couple's union and compared their future together to an oyster creating a pearl around a grain of sand. Fuller also designed Ruth's wedding ring, shown here, from a river stone with silver bands shaped like interlocking A's in Asawa. Albert had heard that young artists could live quite cheaply in San Francisco. The story, or perhaps the myth, was that you could get a 3-course dinner with red wine for 50 cents. That wasn't exactly true, but it was relatively progressive and a welcoming place to a penniless young bohemian couple who moved into a bare 60-foot-long loft over an onion warehouse with no walls or kitchen. But to them, it was paradise, like something out of the opera La Boheme, only without the tears and tragedy. Well, just in time, the California State Supreme Court abolished the law against interracial marriages. So Ruth and Albert were able to exchange their wedding vows without hitchhiking to Reno. True to her dream of having 6 children, Ruth and Albert wasted no time in starting their family. Here you can see them holding their daughter, Aiko, and their son, Xavier. 4 more would follow, Hudson, Adam, Addie, and Paul, fulfilling Ruth's dream family of 6 kids, all within the decade that she launched her studio art practice. She and Albert were trailblazers in blending their family of biological and adopted children. Theirs was an inclusive household long before it became trendy. Well, by the early 1950s, Ruth Asawa was breaking all boundaries of conventional sculpture with her signature looped wire hangings. She had learned this basic technique of looping wire during a student service trip to Mexico. There, she had met local craftsmen who made wire baskets to take their eggs and produce to market. Ruth took that basic looping technique and expanded it to make these long, undulating sculptures in which the outside turns inward to become the inside and back again, sort of like a amoeba strip. Her art is transformative, turning the industrial material used for fences, including those barbed wire fences in the internment camps, into transparent, ethereal, suspended mesh creations. Here's a sculpture that combines aluminum and brass for a sort of shimmering gold effect. She utilized all kinds of wires and all colors of metal. At a time when most sculpture was made by men out of wood or stone or steel anchored to the ground, her weightless creations suspended from the ceiling were radical. And some critics didn't even consider them to be sculpture at all and resisted showing them in exhibitions. But a gallery in Manhattan exposed her to important collectors like the Rockefellers and the architect Philip Johnson. Now, of course, her work is found in many collections around the country, including the de Young Museum in San Francisco, the SF MoMA, the Whitney Museum of Art in New York, and the David Zwirner Gallery in New York, and many, many more. Asawa also makes, along with the closed spheres and smooth ovals and figure eights, Asawa also experimented with open work featuring these windows with flared edges. It is said that this originated from a mistake. She was looping wire one day, and she made a mistake that she wasn't able to untangle, realizing that she had to cut the edge. She thought she might have to sacrifice the piece, but instead, the weight of the hanging sculpture on the open edge opened these flared windows. So serendipity played a big role in a lot of her creativity. This portrait by Imogen Cunningham, a photographer and friend of the family, shows Ruth's intensity while she was working on a looped wire sculpture with a coil of wire at the left. Notice that the index finger on her right hand, if you look closely, you can see just under her chin, is bound with masking tape to protect her fingers from being cut and scraped while sculpting. Those sculptures may look delicate and ethereal, but the edges are extremely abrasive and sharp. Here's another looped wire sculpture that's lighted to show the shadow play of the pieces, revealing inner contours and the intricacy of the work, and those inside out layers that curve like amoeba strip. Here's another Cunningham portrait of Ruth working on her back that illustrates for us the mammoth proportion of some of these pieces. The longest of her looped wire sculptures is actually 21 feet long. If you look closely, you can see the wedding ring designed by Buckminster Fuller on her left hand. This portrait is one of many people's favorites. We can see Ruth sculpting amid her growing family. Unlike many of her female contemporaries on the modern art scene, who sacrificed a personal family life in favor of making art, Asawa intentionally chose to have both. She chose to make her studio at home so there would be no walls between art and life or work and family. She wanted her kids to see her at work, making art. And imagine, she even declined an offer by a design firm to hire her a nanny and housekeeper so that she could produce more sculpture. I wonder how many of us would have the discipline to say no to that offer. She wanted all aspects of her life integrated into an organic whole. And these days, in shelter in place, a lot of us have been combining work and family under one roof. So we can, I'm sure, have an enhanced appreciation for what it took to actually choose that lifestyle. Here's a holiday portrait of Ruth and Albert surrounded by their 6 children. Xavier, Iko, Hudson, Adam, Addie, and the youngest Paul riding a toy horse. All of her children became creative people in adulthood. Iko is a painter. Xavier, Hudson, and Adam became builders. Addie wrote and taught, and today runs the estate office. And Paul, the youngest, is a ceramicist. This portrait from 1964 shows the artist demonstrating the art of origami, or folded paper, to the then 4-year-old Paul, who is closely observing his mother's lesson. Asawa's art practice was bound up inextricably to her vocation as an art educator. Here we can see an installation shot showing Ruth seated amid her hanging wire sculptures, and you can see the tremendous variety of shapes and sizes. This was taken at the San Francisco Museum of Art when it was on Van Ness, and it's now, of course, known as the SF MoMA. Asawa continued to make loop wire sculptures well into the late 1990s when she was in her 70s, but she kept evolving new forms of sculpture, as we'll see next. In 1962, she took on a challenge from her friend, the photographer Paul Hassel. He had just come back to the city from a trip to the desert with a spiky sort of tumbleweed-like plant for Ruth. He asked her if she could draw it. But the structure of the radiating branches was so dense and complex, she decided that she would try sculpting it instead. And this experiment led to Ruth's tied wire sculptures, where she would take oftentimes as many as 1,000 filaments of wire and separate them off into ever finer and smaller branching bundles. Some of these sculptures are tree forms mounted on bases, as you see here, while others are flat star shapes and hanging sort of spherical tied wires, many of which are on display at the De Young Museum. But Asawa's work didn't exclude representational art. And in fact, her first public commission was this fountain entitled Andrea, popularly known as the Mermaid Fountain. It's the centerpiece of the courtyard in Ghirardelli Square in San Francisco's waterfront. This year of 1968 brought another milestone. Asawa started noticing her kids coming home from school with ditto sheets to color in as art. You know, Thanksgiving turkeys, Easter bunnies with cottontails, and so forth. She thought that the schools could and should be doing much better. So she led a group of volunteers, parents, artists, and just like-minded folks in the neighborhood in launching the Alvarado Arts Project. It began as a summer school crafts program that went year-round and citywide. Here you can see Ruth at a school arts festival. She gave decades of her time, energy, and passion to children. You can see some of these milk carton sculptures behind her bear a sort of crafty resemblance to some of those geometric models that Buckminster Fuller was making back at Black Mountain. The National Endowment for the Arts recognized Ruth and her colleagues in a report that declared that Ruth Asawa and colleagues were building a city of gold with their art activism in San Francisco. Ruth Asawa spoke very, very little in public about her years in internment camp. But in 1994, she got to tell the story of her generation in bronze. She received a commission from the city of San Jose to sculpt this monumental work, of which we see just a detail. This is the Japanese American Internment Memorial. And this is one detail of the 5 by 14 foot wall depicting the Japanese American community around World War II. You can see here scenes of the camps, the guard tower and barbed wire, the barracks and the imprisoned families struggling against harsh desert and mountain winds. Next, you'll get a peek at the work in progress. Asawa worked on this piece with her son, Paul, shown on the right, and her colleague Nancy Thompson, seated at the left, before a section of the original, which was modeled in baker's clay. Baker's clay is a modeling material made from a simple recipe of flour, salt, and water that Asawa created for her children to use at home to entertain themselves initially, and later she spread the word that this was a great material that could be whipped up at any time in any amount for school arts projects. So they first modeled the internment memorial in baker's clay in sections before it was cast in bronze using the ancient lost wax method, right nearby at the Artworks Foundry in Berkeley, California. Today, the piece stands right by the federal courthouse in San Jose, California. And if you haven't had a chance to visit it, I urge you all to do so. It is absolutely magnificent and a moving piece of history. Ruth Asawa also adapted other art forms drawn from her Japanese cultural heritage in her fountain sculptures. She was always exploring new forms and fusing them with traditional Japanese methods. She transformed origami here, the Japanese art of folded paper, again into sculpture. This piece is one of two fountains in Japantown Peace Plaza in San Francisco, originally made out of steel, pleated into a form sort of resembling a lotus. The first version of this piece from 1976 rusted beyond repair, and so the fountains were removed and recast in bronze and then reinstalled in 1999. Today it's a favorite spot, or at least before the shutdown was a favorite spot for old and young to gather and sit in the sun. And we're hoping that with reopening that people will once again be able to enjoy them. In this piece called Aurora, for the Roman goddess of the dawn, Asawa used stainless steel in a fountain facing the Embarcadero of San Francisco. It frames the rising sun over the East Bay Hills, and you can see a little bit of the Bay Bridge there as well. This sculpture was installed around Asawa's 60th birthday, following a diagnosis with the condition lupus. Among the symptoms of this autoimmune condition, Asawa experienced numbness and a loss of strength that left her largely disabled for much of the year 1985. She endured strong medical treatment with chemotherapy and steroids that helped her achieve a remission, but often left her sleepless for days on end. While recovering and up all night from the steroids, she would write and plan sculptures. These nocturnal writings were full of insights about her art and her life, her philosophy, and even poetry. And they are preserved today at Stanford Special Collections in the Ruth Asawa papers. In 1989, Asawa became the first artist appointed to serve on the DeYoung Museum's Board of Trustees. She shook up those staid Board of Trustees meetings by showing up at one of her early meetings with a stack of paper and instructions as to how all of the trustees could learn origami that day. After the Loma Prieta earthquake damaged the old museum structure and plans got underway to build the new DeYoung, the then director Harry S. Parker III and architects invited Ruth to give her input and ideas into their redesign. Asawa was a passionate advocate for education, having pride of place in the new DeYoung, and so they installed classrooms and educational resources in the tower. Asawa also, in addition to this pivotal design advisory role, gifted the museum with 15 of her looped and tied wire sculptures. The opening of the new museum in 2006 featured an Asawa retrospective called Contours in the Air. Shown here during the annual Bouquets to Art event, the Tower Lobby Gallery is one of the DeYoung's 4 areas that is always free to the public. Well, here you can see a sort of sweet contemplative portrait of Albert and Ruth as a couple in their later years, taken by their son-in-law, Lawrence Cuneo. They were married for almost 6 decades, partners in love and art, supporting each other's work in sculpture and architecture, and also advocacy for the public schools. they helped to launch what is now known as the Ruth Asawa San Francisco School of the Arts. It's sort of our Fame high school, if you remember that movie. They fought bureaucracy for decades to ensure children were given every opportunity to express their creativity. They helped to raise $150 million in bond funds toward renovating a new home for the art school in the Civic Center Arts Hub. That particular dream of moving the school downtown sort of remained their unfinished symphony. And it's one of the few sort of frustrating reality checks in an otherwise fairy tale story of love and art that the Asawa Lanier family endured. I'm sort of hoping that perhaps one of the things interested in my book might do would be to attract an angel with matching funds and the political will to get this done. Here, Ruth and Albert are shown pausing in their garden, and it's kind of a poetic through line in my story in the book that having met one another in a garden, they continued to garden throughout their lives together. Well, this sculpture, dating from 1970, has a story that I get to tell because it made art market history in the 2000s. Asawa's work throughout her 87 years was so prolific and her public service so nonstop that it just staggers the imagination. And her star has never dimmed in San Francisco, where she's been a beloved icon. But in New York, where collectors embraced her in the mid-1950s, her work had sort of become eclipsed by 2000 by other trends in art, from abstract expressionism to pop art to conceptual art and so forth. But in my book, I get to tell a wonderful story about how a chance phone call from the family, actually about something completely different, alerted a New York curator to the fact that there was this neglected genius in San Francisco. The family was actually raising funds for Ruth's elder care at home, and they wanted to auction off a painting. It was a painting by Joseph Albers and worth a good deal of money. Artist families, of course, oftentimes are more rich in art than in cash. And so I get to tell a story, sort of a poignant story, in fact, about how one of the Asawa Lanier children called Christie's Gallery and offered up this Joseph Albers painting for sale. And the curator, Jonathan Labe, said, well, who is your mother that she has a Joseph Albers actually inscribed to her, to Ruth, on the back? And they said, well, our mother is an artist. And so the curator thought, I should explore this a little further. So he said, do you have any images of her work? And they said, yes. And they sent him some slides. And suddenly there was an epiphany. And Jonathan Labe realized that this was a neglected genius. Well, Mr. Labe decided to put up this work for auction. And at a time when Asawa's had been going for several hundreds of dollars or perhaps several thousands of dollars, this particular sculpture sold for $1.4 million. Sadly, that market milestone came just months before Ruth Asawa died at age 87. It was a bit of an irony because no one could have been less materialistic than Ruth Asawa. But Mr. Labe, who now represents Asawa's estate at the David Zwirner Gallery, has continued to fuel her posthumous career trajectory by mounting Asawa shows and retrospective exhibitions in the US and England, and plans call for more of her work to be shown this coming year, health situations permitting, in Oxford, England, Stavanger, Norway, Paris, and in Barcelona in 2021 and 2022, if the global public health measures allow art venues to reopen. And those auction values, in case you're wondering, they've continued to soar, with a Ruth Asawa wire sculpture fetching $5.4 million in July 2020. Well, recently, the story of Ruth Asawa has exploded on other new media platforms. In May 2019, her work was celebrated with a Google Doodle, as shown here. And if you all do internet searches as often as I do, you'll know immediately why this sketch triggered such a massive wave of searches that it ended up temporarily crashing her website, ruthasawa.com. And then most recently, on August 13th of this past summer, 2020, the US Postal Service honored the artist by issuing a Ruth Asawa Forever stamp in a set of 10 designs depicting her signature wire sculptures. And it seems so apt for an artist who always insisted that art isn't just for the elite, but for everyone. Now anybody can own a picture, an image of an Asawa for the price of a 55-cent stamp. And in closing this part of the program, I would just like to say on a personal note that particularly in a year of challenges, having had the chance to tell Ruth Asawa's story in my book, a story of transcending every hardship and taking joy in making and sharing art, has moved and inspired and in many cases sustained me. Asawa often said that she bore no bitterness for the hardship of war because it made her who she was, and she liked who she was. She was a genius at art, endowed with the gift for turning swords into plowshares and barbed wire into sculpture. And now I'd be more than glad to take any questions you may have about the book.
Wow, that is an unbelievable story. I haven't read the book, so this is all news to me, and I really was unaware of her story, and I should have been. When my folks divorced in my 20s, my mother remarried a Japanese American man who had been interned, and I actually feel really bad now that I never explored that with him because he's no longer with us. And even his kids, my step siblings, didn't have a lot of answers about that. I don't think he, like a lot of people, wanted to talk about it.
Well, you
my
know,
wife and I went to the show over at the Presidio a couple of years ago about the internment, and then I started asking them questions. And Howard was in a place in Arizona and just never brought it up. But
yeah.
so many parts of your presentation were fantastic. We do have some questions, and we'll just get started with that. What attracted you to her, and then decide to write about her, this story? I mean, what started it?
Well, first and foremost, I'm a reporter. As I said, I'm not a curator or an art historian. So it was, as I said, it was really the existence of an archive in a library that just fascinated me. The existence of a brand new archive. I learned about it in the summer of 2014. I was actually looking for my next project. And the idea that there was this fresh archive unexplored by researchers at the time, I wanted to be the first one to read through all 275 boxes. Of course, I knew the stature of Ruth Asawa. I knew of her fame as a sculptor. And I knew the basic story that she had endured incarceration in World War II. And I've always been drawn to people of genius in the arts or sciences who make breakthroughs in creativity or in public health, despite huge odds, either civil rights abuses or a breach of civil liberties. And I thought that this just sounded like an amazing hero's journey. I hope that that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. Well, we're starting to get some more here. Here's one that I share. This audience member asked, how does she make the sculptures? Does she start with the inside first and then do the outside?
Well, she begins by taking a wooden dowel and winding wire around it. Now, I never saw Ruth sculpt. Her family used to do sort of show and tell demonstrations at museums when there would be exhibitions. Her daughter or her granddaughter would do a little demo. But as often happens with artistic works of genius, they drew I guess, the sincerest form of flattery, imitation, including some copycat works. So the family stopped doing this. But they involved this kind of simple, originally basket looping technique that she then expanded. And she would, in fact, take the outside in and the inside out. And her signature form is actually called the continuous form within a form sculpture. And what that means is that she would curve those surfaces inside and out. And one of the reasons that lighting is so important is that when you look at the sculpture, you sometimes can't even appreciate all of the layers and the way that the curving surfaces move in and out. Sometimes she's worked from the bottom up and sometimes from the top down. So it was different every time.
It's crazy. Are there other artists that then started producing this type of art other than that copycat you mentioned?
Well, there are a couple. I guess one could the positive spin one could put on it is that they're sort of an homage. I don't know their names, but they sometimes advertise their works as being by someone in the Asawa studio or a student of Ruth Asawa. And as far as we know, she didn't have, she had a studio, but she didn't have people whom she was teaching to make looped wire sculptures. So the family sometimes has to make sure that people aren't suggesting that that something is a genuine Asawa, but I don't know the names of these individuals. That sometimes you can see them online, or you'll see an offer for sale of a possible Ruth Asawa, and usually it's best to look on those with a skeptical eye unless they're ascertained by the family and the provenance is proven.
Exactly. A couple people are asking about what happened to her father.
Oh, that's such a poignant story. I actually, speaking of archives and libraries, the National Archives and Records Administration, and this is something that your step siblings might want to pursue sometime. NARA has individual files on, I believe, every person who was incarcerated in these war relocation camps. So I obtained digital copies of these voluminous files on both Ruth and her father. And her father, believe it or not, at the time of his arrest, I believe he was nearing retirement age. He was around 60. He was a well-known and respected truck farmer in Norwalk, California. He was I think active in the local agricultural associations, but was absolutely loyal to the United States. But because he was a productive farmer, there was a lot of, I think, envy and jealousy within the agricultural industry. Apparently, Japanese American farmers were tremendously productive, and their farms were sort of an object of some jealousy. He also gave his children kendo lessons, and all of these things, being an influential farmer in the neighborhood, giving his children kendo lessons and communicating the culture to them, made him somehow suspect in the ideas, in the view of the Department of Justice. So he, along with Japanese teachers, I believe religious figures, community leaders, successful business people in the Japanese American community, were swept up in the first wave of arrests. So he was literally tending his strawberry plants when he was picked up by 2 FBI agents in the field. And the family actually didn't know where they took him for many months. He was first interrogated at a jail, I believe, in Southern California, and eventually made his way to Lordsburg, New Mexico, where there was a very tough alien enemy camp. And that, I think, also eventually included some prisoners of war. But it was very harsh. And Ruth received at one point, when she was, I believe, in Teachers College in Milwaukee, if I'm not mistaken, a carved wooden box that her father made for her with a painting on the bottom and inscribed, "To Ruth from Daddy," with a heart and a bow. Very, very sweet. He survived the war, and eventually he was reunited with his wife. And of course, they had lost their farm. They lost the farm animals, the tractors, the house, the crops in the field, all their goodwill, just painstakingly created through decades of backbreaking work. And they began by, I guess everyone was given a bus ticket and $25. So they made their way to Arizona, where they did stoop labor in someone else's fields to make some money, and then returned to Southern California to start all over again with a little tomato stand. And when Ruth was being courted by Albert Lanier, the two of them went to Southern California and painted them a sign for their tomato stand, their little garden stand by the side of the road. So they painstakingly made a comeback at an age, in their golden years, when many people would have been
You shouldn't
retired
have to.
in life. Right, right.
Wow. Okay. Can you tell us about the fountain / sculpture that was or is near Union Square?
Right. The Hyatt San Francisco fountain is a great favorite. And that is the sculpture that was commissioned by combination of Hyatt Hotels and Skidmore, Owings and Merrill architecture firm. And Skidmore, Owings and Merrill had an architect who knew about Asawa's sculpture. And he contacted Ruth. Ruth got the commission. And they liked the sort of bas-relief effect that Ruth could get by sculpting little figures and mounting them on these curved panels. So she designed this sort of squat cylindrical fountain basin that has scenes of San Francisco, and was mounted on the stairs beside the Hyatt Hotel right there at Post and Stockton. And for many years was kind of reigned in solitary splendor right there on that sort of bare staircase. It's a great favorite, even with the unsighted community. So the Lighthouse for the Blind will oftentimes bring visitors. It's a sculpture that begs to be touched. And in fact, when they unveiled it, they said, this is a sculpture that against the sort of conventional ban against touching art, they invited people to touch this sculpture. In fact, they wanted it to be like the Porcellino, the little piglet sculpture, the little boar sculpture in Florence, Italy, where people rub the snout so much that the bronze turns gold. They wanted to have highlights on the bronze figures and San Francisco scenes. But it's great fun because people love to pick out the scenes. They see little scenes of Chinatown with the Dragon Parade. There's a little scene of Haight-Ashbury with the Victorian house and a little hippie couple. There's even a scene of Ruth's daughter Aiko's wedding that you can find on the sculpture. So it's a great favorite. But there was a moment of some concern because when Apple decided to build a giant new retail store right on the corner of Post and Stockton, they had to remove it during construction. So it was whisked away to Artworks Foundry, I think, where it was stored and cleaned and restored. And originally, I think the footprint of the store was so big, people weren't sure that there was going to be room for it. But there was a big letter writing campaign. People were campaigning to bring the sculpture back. And the design firm did announce summer of 2013, I think, just around the time that Ruth Asawa passed away, that the design footprint, in fact, would allow for the reinstallation of the sculpture. So now it's in this nice niche with a little stand of trees behind it, which I like to think Ruth Asawa might have enjoyed because she always loved combining greenery and bronze. She thought that that made a kind of magical combination for the presentation of her art. So
Nice.
yeah.
Can you elaborate, how we doing on time, on her role bringing art to the San Francisco schools? And did she teach or work on curriculum, or I suppose both?
She did on kind of a volunteer basis, and there were workshops, and she was a presence. She was always a presence in festivals like the MADS Festival, and they would hold doe-ins at the DeYoung Museum, where she would bring lots of baker's clay for the children to make figures. She never had a classroom of her own because she didn't have a regular credential, and she wasn't a regular faculty member at the Ruth Asawa San Francisco School of the Arts, which sort of hurt some feelings. But she was always juggling many things. She was running her own studio. She was always involving children in her artwork. She also encouraged and pioneered the creation of mosaics and murals on the outside of school walls. So it's hard to cast our minds back to the early 60s before such things existed. But Asawa and her fellow volunteers in Alvarado Arts used to say that school walls were painted as sort of Alcatraz gray-green, surrounded by chain link fences, and were really pretty bland looking facades. But now, of course, most schools have a mural or a mosaic, and they even painted the hopscotch squares red and pink and brilliant colors, but they had to get approval from the unions to do so. So it was a long fight, but she really did revolutionize art and accessibility of art to the kids.
Great. Here's a question. Did Ruth usually sketch out her sculpture or do it free form?
That's a great question. Thank you so much for that question. She actually most often did not sketch in advance, although if some of you noticed in the slide of the stamps, you'll see on the little side image called the selvage, there is a picture of Asawa sketching. She occasionally made sketches, but most often I think the forms, if I've understood all of the wonderful expertise that Aiko, her daughter, has passed on to me over many conversations and interviews, most often they grew organically. And she began by thinking that, and this was often true of her work process, she wanted to see how far she could push the material. That for her was the challenge and sort of the joy of creation, how far she could make a form stretch, how many embedded, spheres and loops and contours she could make in the piece. So most often she didn't sketch. Although it would be different, of course, in terms of the mermaid sculpture. For that, of course, there were many sketches that evolved. And also with the Japanese American internment memorial, there were many, many sketches, lots of research and a lot of consultation between Ruth and her two co-workers, her son Paul and Nancy Thompson. Those were sketched.
Okay. Actually, that brings up a question about the wire. A lot of the alloys that exist today weren't available to her then. Do you know, if this is too granular, you can just say forget it, but how did she get her wire, and did she choose different things for different shapes?
She did. She used different, she used brass, she used aluminum. She occasionally, for small sculptures, used gold. There's some tiny mini sculptures that used gold. Sometimes some of the wire had an enameled finish. So for example, there are some sculptures made in copper wire that had an enamel finish that have a sort of beautiful reddish bronze kind of glow. And I think you can appreciate if when the museums are all open again, if you have a chance to visit the DeYoung, you can appreciate some of these different colors of wire in the Tower Gallery, because the walls are just sort of unfinished concrete, which is the perfect backdrop for appreciating some of these different colors of wire.
Absolutely. Well, we're going to make a beeline for that when we go back. How did you arrive at the title for your book?
Oh, thank you for asking that. I wanted a little nugget of reality in the title. I didn't just want to spin something out of my own head. And so the title actually is sort of a riff on a compliment that another artist gave to Ruth Asawa. The lithographer June Wayne ran a lithography center called the Tamarind Institute, which Ruth attended. And at one point, Ruth was applying for a foundation grant, and June Wayne wrote a letter recommendation in which she said, anything she touches becomes art. She could make art out of a mud puddle if she wanted to. And so I kind of tweaked that to say everything she touched, because in her lifetime, it was kind of a theme of her just very existence that everything she touched, she turned into something beautiful, including the hardships in her life. She turned into an opportunity to make something beautiful. In camp, she took her time and made art, and would even say art saved us. And she would take this fairly uninteresting material like a bale of wire, a commodity that, you know, you might make a fence or tie things together with, and turned it into sculpture. So I wanted to get a sense of that kind of alchemy or transformational quality into the title of the book. And in all honesty, I have to say, it wasn't my first idea. I went through several ideas and ran them by my agent and friends and others until I finally settled on this one. And people got on board and agreed that that was a winner. We would stick with it.
I think it's a winner for somebody who hasn't read the book. It just has a great grab. Did she ever get reunited with any of those Disney cartoonists that she met in camp? Or did she meet them, or were they just there?
Oh, that is a great question. And thank you for asking it. I'm not aware from my research that they ever met again, although she did get a letter from one of them, and it was actually very sweet. She made contact perhaps through one of the artist's sons. And Ruth always gave sort of paid respect to them for the incredible kind of inspiration and hope that they instilled. Imagine being in your sweet 16 year, and instead of, you know, planning college applications and proms and fun things like that, you're stuck living in a, you know, foul horse stall. And all of a sudden there's a stroke of magic and you get to study with Walt Disney artists. So I believe it was Tom Okamoto who wrote to her when she was an established artist and thanked her for her always paying respects to him in her speeches and so on, and said something like, "We haven't always been pen pals, but I want you to know that I've followed your career too." So it was very sweet. She did also stay in touch with Joseph Albers and Buckminster Fuller her whole life. And the correspondence between those artists and Ruth is truly wonderful. And the privilege of reading it when I was doing my book research was incredible, because she was very reverent toward all of her mentors, both individually as just an artist, and also I think from her background, her reverence for elders and for her teachers, be it her, you know, Japanese calligraphy sensei or Joseph Albers or Buckminster Fuller. And they wrote to each other and they would trade art, and they visited each other throughout life. She was a great letter writer, and she was a great writer, which is really amazing because it's not always the case. A visual artist would just naturally be an amazing, eloquent writer. but it was great to kind of be able to discover that voice that she had in her writings.
It's fantastic. You know, it's just like so many great artists. The fact you point out that most of her recognition, at least financially, was posthumous, and I guess that's just kind of the way it is most of the time. Not that often that artists get the full benefit of their abilities and fame while they're still living.
Yeah, in fact, she said she once said to her daughters that the artist always pays for the privilege of doing the work, and that was just a reality to her. She did it for the joy of creation, not for monetary rewards. But it is kind of amazing that the market has, you know, belatedly awakened to her work and its value. It's really kind of wonderful.
We've run a little long. I'm going to finish with one final question. Is this? I know you're riding the wave of this book, but do you have something else in the works?
I hope to, and I hope it'll be sooner rather than later. I'm sort of scanning the horizon for my next project, because for me, I mean, this book was just the best project I've ever had a chance to do, and there's nothing quite like the adventure of doing the research and doing the writing. So hope to update you on that soon.
Great. Well, this has been a joy. It's really been fun to listen, and to see the pictures really add so much. That was fabulous. And thank you so much for appearing with us. And
I'd like to add my thanks too. And
Okay.
I was enthralled reading the book, and I highly recommend it to all our audience members.
Well, thank you all so much. Thanks to the audience for hanging in there and for asking great questions. And I hope you all get a chance to see the book. I think Chronicle Books, if I could just sort of a moment for to plug my team, did a really lovely job of reproducing some of the art in the book. They really invested in kind of the look and feel of the book, so that you can get a sense for the contours and the colors and the diversity of her creative body of work. So just thanks again to you, and thanks for having such great cultural programs and keeping them alive this past year.
All right.
Thank
Everybody
you.
go to Orinda Books and buy the book. Okay, Marilyn. Ellen, any last words?
No, just hope that everybody tunes in for some of our upcoming lectures, both WOW and Sweet Thursday. And we hope to, well, we'll never see you, but we hope you're seeing us then.
Thank you all.
Okay.
Right.
Thank you. Bye now.
Right.